This is the Rogue Insider podcast.
Good afternoon, V. Nice to talk to you again.
Hi, W.
Now, I'm wanting to explore Peter Sloterdijk and his book trilogy, Spheres. Now, and I'm coming from a place of, I haven't read it. It's over 2,000 pages. It's incredibly enticing, and I want to know more. And from what you've told me, you've not only read it, but you've taken a lot of notes.
That's correct.
So, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to persist with some questions here. I actually, first of all, want to know who Peter Sloterdijk is.
Well, Peter Sloterdijk is a German philosopher, previous rector at the Karlsruhe University of Art and Design, and a well-known media personality in Germany after his Philosophical Quartet television show.
Wow, a TV philosopher.
Yep.
TV philosopher for one series, was it?
No, it ran for like 10 years.
Wow, well, I haven't heard of him before. And he's obviously German, and is it in other languages? His TV show translated, subtitled? No. Is it on YouTube?
It is. There are episodes of De Philosophische Quartet on YouTube, but you will have to be able to speak German to listen to them.
Wow, I'm not proficient with German, unfortunately.
Neither, sadly.
Right. Now, you told me that he has written the series Spheres, and you discussed a part of it with me. Now, you referred to it as his magnum opus at one stage?
Yeah, that's right.
So he has obviously written quite a few books, and I'm not going to ask for the full bibliography listing there. But Spheres, the magnum opus, is the book that you've focused on. You've focused on the one book or the whole series?
I've read all three of them. My focus was primarily on the second of the two, Globes, but I've also read Foams a few times over as well. Bubbles, the first book in the series, I've only read once or twice. So it's less the focus of my reading.
Right. So is it possible to summarize what the books are about?
Not while doing them any justice.
Okay. Is it fair to ask for an unjust summary?
Yes.
Perhaps an illusion? It is fair. Okay.
Absolutely.
Could you give one? Okay.
For those willing to be shortchanged, you could say that the Spheres trilogy constructs a new overview of world history.
That's a very concise. Concise. Okay, a new overview of world history. I'm going to want to explore that.
Please be aware that you have just been shortchanged.
Yeah. Well, if it's all I've got to work with, I'll take it. Now, why would I want a new overview of world history?
Because after post-structuralism, the skepticism of all meta-narratives has metastasized in academia into a constantly negating cancer that prevents anybody from thinking in grand terms. And this is the chemotherapy.
Woo! Right, I'm going to have to translate that, and the only way I can translate that concisely is to use what I interpret as an example, and that would be the tendency to continue fracturing our interpretations and the structures by which we analyze our world into smaller and smaller pieces, rather than utilizing another alternative.
Yes, that's correct. Rather than constructing an idea and saying, I believe this is useful for explaining things, instead we take an idea and say, this consists of smaller parts, and constantly atomize thought again and again and again until we end up with this fine granular sand. And one thing you may know about sand is it's rubbish for building with.
Okay, no,
Or
not
on.
much integrity. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I come from a commerce background,
Mm.
and having done my 4 years time at university, and a lot of what I interpret in philosophy is lensed by market philosophy and
Right.
market theory. So when I consider the fracturing or atomizing or breaking down of things into various fields, um, I'm immediately drawn to relationship management and relationship marketing,
Mm.
and how we have relationships between agents in a marketplace, and we have the nodes of the agents themselves, and the dynamic of the exchange and the agreed upon mediums of exchange between agents, and all the other influencing agents that, and the environment at large that's affecting it, which would be perhaps holism. And we start to break into relationship marketing. You've got industrial relations theory. You've also got your like collusion management. You've got your holism and the engaging with the environment as a whole. There's all, and it just carries on from there. Those are three, and then it'll just continue breaking into more and more, and you pick and choose as to what's relevant, as to what has greater or lesser influence.
Mm.
And it frustrated me because I didn't find that, even with the use, or the coining however many years ago of the term holism in market theory, it didn't satisfy me because it didn't strike me as holistic. It was just a way to expand what we comprehended as an ecos, or the ecosystem, or like some sort of environmental pressures. But even then, those environmental pressures then had to be broken down into categories, which is fine because you need to identify dominant nodes or dominant influencing, how would you say, constructs.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always dissatisfied because there was always more. And so I spent a lot of time trying to develop and understand how I could perceive of the greater scheme. And so my papers tended to focus on trying to map the principal and agent dynamic and the environment at large. It ended up quite depressing, I'll admit.
Mm.
But I think that there's some crossover here, in that there's a desire in me to understand a greater schema in a more efficient sense.
Well, I think I have an entry point for you into Sloterdijk. At the beginning of the age of colonisation, one of the innovations that allowed the age of colonisation to take place was these large ocean-going vessels. Peter Sloterdijk also points out that the Dutch invented insurance at this point, and insurance was a way of moderating the risk of each of these ocean-going vessels across the whole market, as I'm sure you're aware.
Mm.
Now, that's maybe not a particularly insightful entry point, but it gives you an entry point, right? So Peter Sloterdijk says, the god of globalization could only be the child of Neptune and Fortuna. Meaning, it's at this time when globalization was taking off, it was this combination of ocean-going vessels and insurance that really allowed the whole thing to spark off and suddenly accelerate. And that's a classic kind of rhetorical flourish that you'll find in Peter Sloterdijk's writings.
Flourishes, right? It's quite, yeah. Okay, so there's
It's
a
beautiful.
beauty in his language and his
Absolutely.
tendency to, okay. Um, is he coming from, is he using a lot of mythos to describe the functioning, or
Yes.
is this what his, okay, well, yes is the answer, because he's clearly just used it there.
Yeah.
Now, that can take us perhaps straight into why spheres. Why is it called spheres? What's a bubble? What's a foam? Or what's going on with this, and why should this concern me? And I'm basically trying to, I'm a utilitarian in a way. If I'm going to absorb this, um, why? What's in it for me?
Well, listeners of our previous podcast will remember that I said that Spheres is not the subject of the trilogy, but rather the theme of the trilogy. And I can't make a specific pitch as to why the spheres will, as a thematic device, will be useful to any particular person, but the ever-presence of spheres throughout the Western tradition makes it likely that there is something that is in them that can be applied if you're finding the approach in your discipline wanting somewhere. As an example, previously you'd mentioned holism in market dynamics. I don't really know what that is, but holism as a principle reflects the spherical nature of things, right? What is whole? A sphere is whole. Why is a sphere whole? Because we think about the world as a sphere and the world as everything. So already the philosophical concepts of the approach that you are taking rest on a set of unexamined assumptions, and when we examine those, often where they take us to is somewhere where spheres are present. So the consistent philosophical investigation of the sphere as a principle can be useful.
Right. I have seen and used spheres in my life and always found it simple and clean a concept, and had already in my own mind found sort of a scalar analogy in the sphere of the planet, and then a sort of perceive of the toroid shape of gravitic, or sort of magnetic influence existing in almost like a spherical shape. There's scales of spheres. There's galactic. There's a spheroid nature to how I conceive of a galaxy, even though it looks quite planar in the way it's spread. Um, I already use sphere to some degree, and if this man is so brilliant, then I'm willing to continue investigating how I can apply um, the philosophy or like the metaphor or analogy of sphere to more things, so that I could get, I don't even know what it is. It seems to be a state of mind where thoughts create almost like a blurry combined thought, synthesis of thoughts, thought feeling state, where I have an intellectual impression of additional meaning that comes from utilizing metaphor and analogy. Um, and I want to explore that, if you can, it sounds perhaps a little bit too very fairy, but I want to explore that with you, if you're willing,
Sure.
with regards to the application of the sphere analogy, in that, okay, to refer to my market-based analysis, perhaps we can look at spheres as a replacement. And this is really quite a beautiful attempt to apply a fix to what I wish I had when I was studying. And if I look at, say, my relationship in the marketplace, okay, I'm a small business operator. I'm running an IT firm, and that's how I get my bread and butter. And I'm dealing with a lot of people and dealing with end user problems. And a lot of my product is sort of end user IQ issues. Some people have the money, but as they get older, their crystalline and fluid IQs tend to decline. So they weigh up the cost of trying to struggle at it and create stress, and then they weigh that against the cost of hiring somebody else to step in and address the issue. And I'm based in a small town, and I'm not competing with big firms, so I have to actually spread my skill set across a huge variety. Now, my sphere of influence is is like that's a commonly coined or termed, it's a common phrase with regards to how far-reaching I can be or go. So there's how sphere might be used in the market already, and also in relationship theory. Now, can you think of any applications, just from what I've said, perhaps, or extensions, where spheres or foams or any other sort of bubble analogy might be useful for me?
Not really. Like a lot of philosophy, it is not really applicable to much of the real world, I would say. Um, because it's happening at this
Okay,
high
so that's
theoretic level, the kind of its material applicability uh, is very little.
I I doubt that. I think what makes the sphere analogy so strong is that it does have a material applicability. I appreciate the response because it's addressing the philosophic nature, which I want to go into. But if I'm looking at, for example, what a country is, what a nation is, like I thought of them as borders, and I thought of them as having borders with other nations, and that was far more abstract until I considered a nation as a sphere and alliances as spheres pressing up against each other to
Mm.
create. I mean, it's not really. Is it like a? Is that a foam?
Well, I think you
How would you
could
use
make
it?
the case that,
International relations.
yeah, I think you could make the case that, historically speaking, Europe is akin to a foam if we accept the analogy of nations as spheres, because um, much like that saying about chess of being broadswords in a broom closet, that is
Yeah,
the international relations equivalent of Europe, right? Lots of small, powerful states with wealth all packed up right next to each other. So that's definitely what a foam is like.
in my experience of foam, I mean, I'm used to stronger foams like a mattress foam, and I can rest my head on a foam.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, I'm dancing into this almost mythical realm of, like I was saying about taking thoughts and abstractions and sort of synthesizing almost like a thought sense or a mind feeling, as strange as it is, a thought feeling, which is all of a sudden it's me laying on a foam, and there's a security and a strength in these bubbles that are linked together. So I'm in a world of pictures in my imagination rather
Mm.
than a breakdown of the logic of how these nations are creating a foundation for empire.
Yeah. Well, okay, consider the term Weltanschauung, right? A worldview. It's spherical in the sense that the world is spherical, but it can also be translated as a world image. And to the degree that we participate in a quote unquote society as a re self hypnotization, we are comforting ourselves. And in fact, one of the core concepts that we didn't deal with in the previous podcast was pampering, right? The relationship of the state to the individual in the first world is one of pampering. So your use of that term, comfort, that's the um, that's where it applies.
And now it's that, I mean, that's a revelation for me because I've had an image metaphor born of just applying spheres and foams to Europe,
Mm.
an image metaphor, and it generated a feeling in me, as sort of thoughts and pictures seem to do, um, of comfort. And now there's this issue of complacency. There's this issue of pampering, and I want to explore that. But it then shifted me back to what I'm looking at for my own um, market activity and how I'm actually part of a system that pampers and supports and provides comfort.
Mm.
A lot of what I'm doing and what sets me apart from my competition is actually how I relate to the client on a personal level. rather than just addressing the technical problems. There's an interface requirement for the end user, which is the humanization of the technical procedure. And that's actually one of my dominant strengths, because personally, I need people, I need connection, I need to relate, I need to brush up against other people's spheres, I suppose. Um, and there is a pampering to that. But I'm playing a role in holding together a system on which these people are foam in a way, but it's a different scale of foam. So this foam analogy has shifted scales.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a multi-scalar analogy, but I should point out that, remember, what the spheres rest on is Sloterdijk's original insight, which is that being is always being with. So to the degree that you're always in the hothouse of your mutual human relationships, that's not necessarily a foam, that's just an innate part of existence. And by existence I mean your particular being. And then the foam is made out of all of these sets of relations.
Revisit the hothouse with me, would you?
Yep, certainly.
So I recall in the previous podcast you mentioned the hothouse and the fecundity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
The quote was,
so
humans can't be anywhere except within the hothouse of their closeness relationships.
And the hothouse is a reference to the increased activity that comes from controlled conditions that facilitate growth.
I would say that the hothouse is a functional metaphor which represents the human condition as being part of communities already. But what's useful about it is hothouses are specifically human constructed mechanisms. So it's useful because it delineates the difference between prior forms of community and reproduction of that community, which was part of what we might call a natural process. There's actually an organicist argument here which is flawed, but we'll skip over that and just say that in the modern world, if you think of the nation state as a hothouse, what's useful about doing that is hothouses are specifically constructed mechanisms that are put in place for the purpose of conditioning the air that is within them for the survival and pampering of the entities that are within the hothouse. So it really brings forward the kind of deliberateness of the way that they are brought into being.
God, that makes me grateful for my little fireplace and the water that I can access and the lifestyle I've got.
Yeah.
Oof. Okay, so there is a very real relevance. What did you say it was about the metaphor? It was a functional metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay, so the spheres metaphor is the grandest of, is it an attempt at the grandest of functional metaphors?
Yes. And why is that?
Nice.
Because
now that piques my interest.
Okay.
Sorry, carry on.
Why is the sphere the grandest of metaphors? The sphere is the grandest of metaphors because throughout the history of Western thought, or it, at the very least, from the ancient Greek philosophers until now, from the moment when we realised that the terrestrial sphere was in fact a sphere, our conception of the world in the times of the ancients was spherical. Our conception of the universe in the times of the medievals was a set of nested spheres within each other, and our conception of the universe in the time of the moderns is whole sets of spheres that are separated from each other by vast astronomical distances between them. And now, in the postmodern age, all of the if we shift the metaphor from the physical universe to the human experience, all of the previous spheres that we have relied on have all been pierced and split open, and when a sphere pops, it blows up into this kind of foam. So we end up in this place of this kind of constantly foaming and foam producing and foam recreating life world that we're in. Interestingly, of course, that takes us all of the way back to the classics. If you remember your classical mythology, you'll know that the goddess Aphrodite, her name means the foaming one, right? Aphros, giving us foam, the one who was born from foams. So Sloterdijk specifically takes the time to discuss Aphrodite in order to point out that the foams are a fertile sphere. They're a fructifying, generative metaphor.
A fertile sphere, you say?
Yes, yes.
Okay, you just seemed to, it was beautiful. It encapsulated your initial proposition that Sloterdijk is offering a new theory of history in a way.
Yeah, he's propositioning a new grand narrative for us to operate within, if we would like to.
And you just seem to summarize that there's a linear progression in the usage of the sphere. And it increases in scale until it gets to the great national alliance of whatever it is, the globalism state.
Yeah.
And you're saying, and then it pops and foams.
Yeah.
So there's an ominous tone to this. And certainly as somebody who wants to, let's say, endure into the future, perhaps it is beneficial to understand that this is happening. Okay, well, here we go.
I would think so.
Now there's a utilitarian dimension to me.
Okay.
Well, for me. And it's, what's this greatest bubble, and how is it popping? And from there, I'm hopefully going to get something that's going to be useful to assist me in how I'm going to prepare myself or apply myself towards achieving what I need to achieve in order to preserve the likelihood of having a bright and enjoyable future.
All right.
Or even a future at all. So if you could explain to me what the big bubble that's popping is and what the foam that may result is, and we can really hit this.
Yeah, great. Let's really dig into this, because there's some very fertile soil here. First of all, let me elucidate an error. After the age of colonization, the sort of Enlightenment ideal of universal... let me even take a step back and say, inside the various nations inside the age of colonization, inside the Dutch, inside the Spanish, inside the English, each had their different languages, their own life worlds that the nation was involved within, and that the nation reproduced the life world, and the life world helped reproduce the nation. And there was an ethnos that was tied to each one of these, and they headed outwards into the world. We could make the argument that the Anglosphere was the primary primary victor of the age of colonization, even after the even after 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. Still, the Anglosphere was the kind of had the ability to make the largest gains in terms of space across the surface of the sphere, right? At one point, the British Empire was occupying a third of the world. Now, an era has arisen from inside the Anglosphere, which is to take the sign of the success of this colonization with the enthusiasms towards rationality that stem from the Enlightenment and sew them together into a new era. And the era is one of universalism, where we say, now we have invented human rights and they apply to everyone. Specific universal human rights is an indicator of the idea that the Anglosphere thinks that its rationality is apt and applicable universally. And this is wrong.
This is telling me that that's already happened. That's happening. How long has that been going on, that we've been living and applying?
Yeah. At the very least, since the age of colonization and going outwards. But I would say that one of the big markers is the League of Nations and the United Nations, right? When America really put forward this proposition of saying, just think of all of the universalist language that stems out of the American political project, and keep in mind here that America is specifically an Enlightenment political project, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? These things are specifically expanding the Anglospheric self-conception into the world, and then saying there isn't anything else. And the era is, when you universalize these principles, you obscure the fact that they actually emerged from within a specific Weltanschauung, a specific life world, a specific cultural practice, a specific technological and temporal context that shaped them. Now, 9/11. The United States, due to its geopolitical success at the end of the Cold War, managed to step outside of history and then was reintroduced back into history again when the outside world, in an act of supreme impoliteness, thrust itself back into the life world of the United States, and therefore back into the life world of the Anglosphere, which is the moment when 9/11 said, actually the values that you think are universal are not universal. The wars that came afterwards, where the United States tried to say, these principles, right, these liberal internationalist principles that we hold, we can push them out into the world where they'll be accepted because they're universal. So this is how I think that these problems and the original era, where they stemmed from, was the obscuring of the context that produced these universal values, quote unquote universal.
I've started to have a stirring of terror because I recently studied a bit on human rights and came to understand that essentially human rights are that which serves the persistence of human biology and society. And of course, in different conditions, there are different rights, and serving that community gives it advantage over another community. So a lot of what makes human rights is what makes a culture more likely to result in a superior position than another culture, and that some sort of transcendent human rights doesn't really exist.
Yes.
And when I look and listen to people who talk about some global agenda to uh, share this new state, which you're talking about, this liberal agenda, um, I'm realizing that those human rights are open to change.
Well, they
Because
were
if you're
only
saying
invented less than 100 years ago.
well, they're only invented because they made the place that uses them stronger than those that don't.
Yeah, and in fact, we can make a really crassly materialistic argument here. When everybody inside a society accepts and expects that their rights will not be violated, all of the energy that goes towards that would usually be spent on protecting though what the rights also protect, i.e., your kind of the self that you have that you continue to generate, right? Like, in the same way that when you trust someone, you don't have to spend nearly as much energy verifying. And then when you multiply that across every relationship inside a society, that frees up a huge amount of energy that can be put into other things, like, for example, wealth or exploration or arms and armaments.
Yeah, and there is a potentially, and this is ugly because this fits in market theory as well. And I'd like to pursue another. I mean, this actually leads into it, which is another topic
Perfect.
of the market as war, which is something. But I can touch on it here, and it's probably going to affect me in all my podcasts, to be honest. And the idea that at a certain point, um, applying your resources to a thing becomes disadvantageous. There's not the ROI drops, right? The returns are not in your favor. And the same goes for human rights. And the classic example is the human right to health, because it is the societies that enable the a uniformity of accessibility to the means by which you can make yourself healthy are the ones that do better than those that don't. And it makes sense straight away. Okay, that serves the biology. It means you have more likely to have better offspring, as long as everyone can access the health if they want it. But there's still this market force of how people want to allocate their resources and how much they want to invest in their own health. And then you have other things, which is a social system that then keeps people healthy if they didn't apply themselves to accessing their own health. And they didn't inform themselves about it. And so all of a sudden it becomes a burden on the tax system to keep people healthy when they were supposed to choose to be healthy because the human right was making it available. That right enabled us because it made our culture stronger that we could be healthy if we wanted. And I really like that. Um, However, it extended further because it started going, well, it's a human right to always be healthy. And then it's a matter of us to make sure that everyone is a certain level of healthy. And so it's like, well, what happens when that starts sliding further up? We need everyone to be a little bit healthier. And at what point does keeping your population, say, if you had a sliding scale from zero being you're about to die of malnutrition and disease to 100, as in you are the Vitruvian form, the optimum human experience, and maybe we need people to be at minimum 20% or 20 on that health scale, and then all this other culture is doing better because they're at 30, and then it starts sliding up, and eventually it actually becomes less competitive because other market forces are introduced, cybernetics, and so the human right for health is likely to be renegotiated. And we have this propensity in our society, certainly in New Zealand, to try and not only make the health services available, and I like that. I don't like the idea that you wouldn't be able to access the means to address your asthmatic attacks, that you couldn't even address it without being having a certain degree of wealth. I like the idea that it's accessible to you, and then if you choose to access it, you can. And if you want to go beyond that, you can try and fund that yourself to be more than whatever level. But there is a return on investment in a competitive environment where states compete with each other, where the economic feasibility needs to be measured. And the prospect that the liberal agenda of creating uniformity across all states in agreement about certain rights, the idea that that bubble is popping and that there may be, as you say, and I'm probably jumping the gun here, a foaming where there's the jostling or renegotiation of positions between different states. Then with that, in that environment of competition, comes the renegotiation of human rights.
Well, to the degree that human rights arise out of a specific cultural context, they're always subject to renegotiation. In fact, I would go further and say they are constantly in a state of negotiation. Right? The tendency that we've seen lately is for the more things to be claimed to be rights over time. But if the claiming of those rights places a tax on the success of the society that invents and puts forward the material outcomes that make those rights able to be achieved, then it's counterproductive. And seeing as the liberal internationalists seem to be incapable of acknowledging that different national and cultural spheres have different priorities, they seem to have ground to a standstill.
Okay, so the evolution has ground to a standstill, you mean?
I mean, the liberal internationalist movement has come to a standstill because they're at an impasse. They can't admit that cultures are different from each other, but they also can't backpedal on the rights that they supposedly provide, because that's what gives them, that's how they give themselves the moral legitimacy to do things like invade other people's nations in the name of democracy or whatever.
Okay, so given that they're always being renegotiated, but they can't be backpedaled, what does a collapsing global structure mean for that? Doesn't it mean that backpedaling could happen, and it could happen very rapidly?
Would you mind being a little more precise about what you mean by collapsing global structure?
Okay, I mean the tendency for nations to operate with, how would you say, stable trade dynamics and encouraging humanitarian agendas.
Right, so like the collapse of the global order as seen by Peter Zeihan.
That's right, yes.
Well, the first thing is to acknowledge that the vast majority of the world is not interested in human rights, and to acknowledge that they are specifically a Anglospheric and European obsession, right? China treats its people like a renewable resource. Human rights are not something that are relevant to them.
Oh, that's heavy.
So, to the degree that the world order that was maintained in the post-Cold War era, up until the withdrawal of the United States from the international arena, a kind of voluntary drawing back and re-entrenchment, approaching but maybe not achieving isolationism, then all of the previous empires that were involved in any colonial projects have to reallocate some of their resources to making sure that they continue to get whatever it is that they need. Those needs necessarily run at cross purposes to everybody else's, and the assumption is a whole number of brushfire wars spring up on all of the boundaries as states compete with each other to fulfill their needs. So what happens to human rights under those conditions? Well, the answer is it entirely depends on which state you are talking about. So again, China doesn't care about human rights. They continue to not care about human rights.
Right.
Yeah. And
Well, they
Europe,
already didn't care, you're saying.
yeah.
So
Whereas,
it's not like there's going to be any dramatic change there.
yeah,
Adopting a policy of human rights might actually gather sway. Maybe they'll go the other direction. Maybe there'll be a political shift, and having human rights enables them to be perceived in a better light, and it's advantageous.
I regard that as
History
unlikely.
says, okay, yeah, yeah.
And look, what is the major source of the contravention of human rights? It's war. So when wars spring up, human rights become irrelevant. And for some reason, this exception doesn't seem to trouble anybody very much.
You say it doesn't trouble people
Yeah.
because it's just known, right?
Yeah,
Because
it's already
everything's on the
baked in.
table.
It's already baked into the cookie, so to speak.
In.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the application of the sphere popping into a foam on a geopolitical scale, and how it's useful to consider this because it gives an instant visual metaphor of what can happen. I think that's incredibly helpful. It's like there's a separate hemisphere in my mind. My right hemisphere, my image brain, is engaged, and it gives me it's a kind of intuition, right? It's an impressionist interpretation.
Yeah, well, this is the strength of overarching narratives, is that they give you a structure, and it makes it really easy to think about larger issues when they're all against a background like that. The weakness, of course, is if you get used to using it, you can lose the ability to think about things in other ways, but I assume that neither of us are there yet.
Speaking of impressionist, does he cover impressionist artworks?
Not that I'm aware of.
So he's more interested in Baroque or
Well,
what's that?
to the degree that he covers, from 10,000 years ago to the modern day, he covers artworks in a lot of ancient and medieval contexts, and also a fair amount of modern art as well. There's a lot of 80s and 90s images that are in here. For example, he has a photo from the Summer Olympics in Barcelona from 1992 as a kind of discussion point. But I don't recall him ever specifically stopping on Impressionism and mentioning it and saying there's something important about it.
Oh yeah, I don't really know so much about Impressionism. It's really just because I gathered the word from my own interpretation of how I perceive images, and people get impressions from all art. It's not as if I needed to refer to specifically Impressionist artworks.
I don't think there's any of Monet's water lilies in here.
Right. Okay, well that's a heavy topic. I appreciate that we've explored that. What about take a break now? That's a good little half hour.
Okay, nice one.
Good to chat. Thanks.
See ya. If this podcast has left you hungry for more, check out episode 1.